Tale of Mrs Tittlemouse by Beatrix Potter. She also illustrated all her little books. She was quite prolific, our Beatrix. I grew up with her and now I'm reading them for my grandchildren. I hope you enjoy the Tale of Mrs Tittlemouse. Look at the beautiful pictures. Oh! And this reading is dedicated to my friend Sandy. Once upon a time, there was a wood mouse, and her name was Mrs Tittlemouse. She lived in a bank under a hedge. Such a funny house. There were yards and yards of sandy passages leading to storerooms and nut cellars and seed cellars, all amongst the roots of the hedge. There was a kitchen, a parlour, and a larder. Also, there was Mrs Tittlemouse's bedroom, where she slept in a little box bed. Mrs Tittlemouse was a most terribly tidy, particular little mouse, always sweeping and dusting the soft, sandy floors. Sometimes a beetle lost its way in the passages. "Shh, shh, little dirty feet," said Mrs Tittlemouse, clattering her dustpan. Off you go. And one day a little old woman ran up and down with a red spotty cloak. "Your house is on fire, Mother Ladybird. Fly away home to your children." Another day a big fat spider came in to shelter from the rain. "Beg pardon, is this not Miss Muffet's?" "Go away, you bold, bad spider, leaving ends of cobwebs all over my nice clean house." She bundled the spider out of a window. He let himself down the hedge with a long, thin bit of string. That gets rid of him now, doesn't it? Now what were we up to? There she is now, busy, busy, busy. Mrs Tittlemouse went on her way to a distant storeroom to fetch cherry stones and thistledown seed for dinner. All along the passage she sniffed and looked at the floor. "I smell a smell of honey. Is it the cowslips outside? In the hedge? I'm sure I can see the marks of dirty little feet. What is it now? Oh!" Suddenly, around a corner, she met Babbity Bumble. "Bzz, bzz, bzz," said Bumblebee. Mrs Tittlemouse looked at her severely. She wished she had a broom. "Good day, Babbity Bumble. I should be glad to buy some beeswax, but what are you doing down here? Why do you always come in at a window and say bzz, bzz, bzz?" Mrs Tittlemouse began to get cross. "Zzz, zzz," replied Babbity Bumble in a peevish squeak. She sidled down a passage and disappeared into a storeroom which had been used for acorns. Mrs Tittlemouse had eaten the acorns before Christmas. The storeroom ought to have been empty, but it was full of untidy moss. Mrs Tittlemouse began to pull out the moss. 3 or 4 other bees put their heads out and buzzed fearlessly. "I'm not in the habit of letting lodgings. This is an intrusion," said Mrs Tittlemouse. "I'll have them turned out. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I wonder who would help me. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I will not have Mr Jackson. He never wipes his feet." There he is. There's Mr Jackson. Mrs Tittlemouse decided to leave the bees till after dinner. When she got back to the parlour, she heard someone coughing in a fat voice. And there sat Mr Jackson himself. He was sitting all over a small rocking chair, twiddling his thumbs and smiling, with his feet on the fender. He lived in a drain below the hedge, in a very dirty, wet ditch. Oh, I thought he was a toad. Look at that. How do you do, Mr. Jackson? Dearie me, you have got very wet. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. I'll sit a while and dry myself, said Mr. Jackson. He sat and smiled, and the water dripped off his coat towels. Mrs. Tittlemouse went around with a mop. He sat such a while that he had to be asked if he would take some dinner. First she offered him cherry stones. Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. No teeth, no teeth, no teeth, said Mr. Jackson. He opened his mouth most unnecessarily wide. He certainly had not a tooth in his head. There's those cherry stones. No. Here he is again. Then she offered him thistledown seed. Tiddly, tiddly, widdly, poof, poof, puff, said Mr. Jackson. He blew the thistledowns all over the room. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. Now I really should like would be a little dish of honey. Honey indeed. I'm afraid I have not got any, Mr. Jackson, said Mrs. Tittlemouse. Tiddly, widdly, widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse, said the smiling Mr. Jackson. I can smell it. That is why I came to call. Mr. Jackson rose ponderously from the table and began to look into the cupboards. Mrs. Tittlemouse followed him with a dishcloth to wipe his large, wet footmarks off the parlour floor. When he had convinced himself that there was no honey in the cupboards, he began to walk down the passage. Indeed, you will stick fast, Mr. Jackson. Tiddly, widdly, widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse. First he squeezed into the pantry. Diddly, widdly, widdly, no honey, Mrs. Tittlemouse. There were 3 creepy-crawly people hiding in the plate rack. 2 of them got away, but the littlest one he caught. Oh! That toad is catching those louse. Ah, look. Then he squeezed into the larder. Miss Butterfly was tasting the sugar, but she flew away out of the window. Diddly, widdly, widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse. You seem to have plenty of visitors. And without any invitation, said Mrs. Thomasina Tittlemouse. Didn't like any of them. It's been such a busy day. Everyone's just coming in through the windows and plonking themselves on the sugar. And they went along sandy passage. Tiddly, widdly, widdly, buzz, buzz, whiz. He met Babbity round a corner and snapped her up and put her down again. I do not like bumblebees. They are all over bristles, said Mr. Jackson, wiping his mouth with his coat sleeves. Get out, you nasty old toad, shrieked Babbity Bumble. I shall go distracted, scolded Mrs. Tittlemouse. She shut herself up in a nut cellar while Mr. Jackson pulled out the bee's nest. He seemed to have no objection to stings. When Mrs. Tittlemouse ventured to come out, everybody had gone away. But the untidiness was something dreadful. Never did I see such a mess. Smears of honey and moss and thistledown and marks of big and little dirty feet all over my clean house. She gathered up the moss and the remains of the beeswax. Then she went out and fetched some twigs to partly close up the front door. I'll make it too small for Mr. Jackson. Fat old toad. She fetched a soft cloth and flannel and a few scrubbing brush from the storeroom, but she was too tired to do any more. First she fell asleep in her chair, and then she went to bed. "Will it ever be tidy again?" said poor Mrs Tittlemouse. Next morning she got up very early and began a spring cleaning which lasted a fortnight. She swept and scrubbed and dusted. She rubbed up the furniture with beeswax and polished her little tin spoons. And when it was all beautifully neat and clean, she gave a party to 5 other little mice without Mr Jackson. He smelt the party and came up the bank, but he could not squeeze in at the door. What a clever mouse, what a clever mouse she was. What's that? Is that him at the window? Well, he couldn't get through the door. Couldn't barge in on her this time. So they handed him out acorn cupfuls of honey through the window, and he was not at all offended. There he is. He's pretty happy. He's finally got his honey. But no, she can't have him in the house. He's just too wet. And he leaves footmarks everywhere. He sat outside in the sun and said, "Diddly widdly widdly, your very good health, Mrs Tittlemouse." And that's the end. But there's lots of other stories. There's Jemima Puddle Duck, Benjamin Bunny, Jeremy Fisher, of course Peter Rabbit, Squirrel Nutkin, Tom Kitten, and the Tailor of Gloucester, one of my favourites. So please find some more stories on my channel if you like the original Peter Rabbit books by Beatrix Potter. Bye.